Yes, indeed, all roads do lead to Poland, and welcome to the show. Today we've got an action-packed panel for you, and we're going to be discussing some of the most exciting developments of the last 6 months and put to rest at last whether or not I'm wearing a toupee. It's a question that comes up from a lot of the readers, and stick around for the answer to that. In the studio with me, I have the inestimable Ivo Bender, Director of EWTN, the television network, Catholic television network in Central Europe, Scandinavia, and a couple of other places I forget, but including Ukraine. Right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, which is very important to our discussion and to our show generally. Welcome back, old buddy.
Glad to be here.
And another old buddy, Phil Goss, who's, you've been away, haven't you, Philip?
I've been here and there, and I'm here again, but I'll be going back there again tomorrow.
Journalist, board member, a man about town, farmer, gentleman farmer.
Gentleman farmer.
In Indiana.
Yes.
A man of means, and as the song goes, but not by no means. Means by means. Ah. And we have on the horn, that is in another, my toupee looks good, and another country called Bydgoszcz, we have Tony, I call him Tony MG, as that was one of my favorite cars. McFarland Gonzalez, our security expert, the former Special Forces medic, who has, boy, we got a lot to talk about today, haven't we? Yeah.
Yes, we do.
And we have Olgierd Ujimbo, who needs no introduction for those who've been watching the show, because he's a regular. And a man who speaks fluent Chinese. Also on the Skype from his lair, his wolf's lair. A Wolfen lair, I call it, because I don't speak German. Over there in the east, on the way to Białystok. It's a beautiful area over there, is it not? Okay, look.
Yes, it is. And good day to you all.
It's very nice to see you, my friend. Yeah. We have a situation on our hands.
Yes, we do.
On our minds. It's not on our hands, but it's on our minds. It's on some people's hands because people like Phil and Tony have been doing a lot of work with the Ukrainians, providing aid, reconnaissance, all kinds of things, and particularly in the medical area, and preparing for wounded and things like that. So for several weeks we've been talking about, what happens if they attack Kherson and cut off that army? And what's happening now is even beyond that. You want to give us a little overview, Ivo, what's going on?
Well, basically what happened was that we don't know whether the Kherson offensive that was so widely publicized before it even started by the Ukrainians, whether it was just a decoy to draw, perhaps it was, but it definitely what we know is that it drew Russian forces from the northeast down to the south, which meant that the lines around Kharkiv were depleted. And the Ukrainians, well, we are talking that maybe, Kherson would be the second Dien Bien Phu, but what happened
Yeah, we were saying that last week, several weeks, actually.
But what happened, actually, is that instead of a static war, we had an absolute blitzkrieg of a Ukrainian offensive up north, which just completely, rolled back the Russians, and pretty much restored the status quo ante from before the February 24th in the Kharkiv region, which is just unbelievable. They really were hightailing out of there, and what conclusions can we draw from that? I don't know. I think it's too early. We'll see what happens next, right?
Phil, what are you hearing? Thanks, Ivo. What are you hearing from your sources?
Well, I've been reading the Intel digests that I get every day, and I think a lot of times we have to read between the lines on these because an Intel digest is not designed to project a complete picture or precise picture of where things are happening, but a general picture for general understanding of the broader situation. But what I find fascinating, I think, are the following 3 points. I was at an economic forum last week, and nobody's talking about the extended conflict. Everyone's talking about what we do to rebuild Ukraine once this thing is finished, once Ukrainians win. And that seems to be the broader accepted expectation. When will that happen? None of us know. But it's clear that we're on the road to a Ukrainian victory, and quite a significant one, because this has changed the way warfare is conducted. The ships and the tanks were useless against the drones. Air defense was ground-based air defense was important because nobody was able to establish superiority in the air. And it was the superiority of the drones and the artificial intelligence which allowed Ukrainians to determine where every particular Russian asset was with precise location that allowed them to really surgically commit surgical strikes and take out armored personnel carriers, tanks, what have you. The second of the 3 is that I'm curious myself about what I'm not hearing insofar as partisan resistance in Belarus is concerned. I think what we're not hearing is by design, because that's something that much of the world's media and many governments, most of the world's governments, would prefer not to talk about at the moment. There will come a time to talk about that come the revolution. And I think that's really what we're
Which revolution would that be?
Well, that would be the Belarusian extension of what almost happened 2 years ago.
Yeah.
I also am somewhat sympathetic towards Lukashenko because he does have to walk a very thin line.
I'm not sympathetic to him at all. I think he's one of the biggest in the whole
clearly,
world.
but my point is this. He's not somebody with many choices.
Oh, yeah, he could. Well,
He has
that's
some
right,
bad
because
choices.
if he stops,
He has bad choices and worse choices, and so I think he takes the bad
he
choice
can't
over
stop,
the worse.
can he? Yeah.
Right. Not that I like him. I just understand that he doesn't have a broad solution set to choose from. But that's his problem. Then what I think the third thing is what we're seeing develop over the most recent days in Russia itself, where we're seeing significant resistance at the grassroots level, at the municipal elected officials in large municipalities level, and we're just waiting, I think, at this point for the oligarchs to turn on their master, because that's to be expected, I think, next.
Thanks, Phil. Olga, what do you think about this? These people, local officials in Moscow and St. Petersburg, coming out against.
Well, what Russian analysts
Putin.
usually, I've been listening to a lot of different people, and what they usually say is that they downplay the role of those people because they do not have a direct access to Putin, and they do not have any leverage over him. So
They don't have leverage, but they do have leverage locally, and the fact that they're saying it is in itself something of note, isn't it?
Yeah, what they're saying is important, and Putin is coming under fire from both sides.
Right.
From the liberal side and also from the hardcore Russian patriot side. But what is, for me at the moment, more interesting is what the hell is Erdogan doing? Because that is really interesting. It is not possible that Azerbaijan just like that attacked Armenia. Erdogan wants to play something, wants to get something from Putin. This is kind of a leverage that he does have. And it's interesting what is his aim here. It's really interesting.
Yes, thank you very much. Good comment. Good comments all around so far. Tony, what are you hearing from your contacts about the situation generally, and how do you like my prediction about the Dien Bien Phu-ism of Kherson? Because those people are bloody well cut off. They're trying to surrender.
Actually, I was just going to hit up on that. Yeah, it was actually spot on about 4 weeks ago. That was when we talked about, we knew that they were going to be enveloped very quickly if the Ukrainians were organized, which they were. They had extremely well-placed intelligence and very well-organized artillery, especially with the Western weapons that they had. However, the offensive is not over yet. They still have to have an unconditional surrender or push back the Russians out of their forces, out of their land areas, because they still have to take back the pre-2014 advance that they had in there in the Donbass region, and they are extremely fortified in there, and that's probably one of the reasons why they have already retreated back there. Most of those retreat routes have been cut off, but they still have some of those retreat routes that they still planned in there. Most of the supplies that have been pushed in by the Russians are not getting there fast enough or at all being pushed in to support the troops. These troops are completely, utterly demoralized. Even the commanders are losing their faith in their own country. So they have two choices. They either surrender unconditionally, lay down their arms, or they fight to the death, or that's it. Laying down their arms is a two-part sword, meaning that either they just run tail and hide back to their country, or they just surrender as POWs, which is also going to be something interesting to see how the Ukrainians handle these Russian POWs, because if they're going to abide by the UN laws, or if they're going to take their matters into their own hands and how they're going to be tried. That's what we're talking about mostly, because that's what we're looking at. As far as Belarusia, we don't know exactly what kind of activity they're going to be going forth. It's not going to be confirmed or denied. There is some activity there. We are also looking at Kurdistan and Tajikistan and how those guys are taking this offensive that the Ukrainians are doing, because they do a lot of business with the Ukrainians and they have a lot of resources, and especially since there's a spaceport there that they are very interested in keeping.
Very good comment. What do you think about, there are two places with oil, Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan. They have a lot of oil that could come this way to Europe during the winter. Those are pretty strategic. You think Erdogan's trying to work with them to?
Yes, but that cannot be confirmed. It is something that we believe that will that would play a heavy effect.
Yeah.
Especially since the president, especially of Kazakhstan, has expressed extreme distrust in the Russians, and they've expressed explicit support to Europeans, as we have seen from intelligence that has been brought forth to us. And it's actually common knowledge, because it's been pushed out to the news about 2 months ago, but he's been reiterating it again. Now, whether or not he's going to still be in power by that time, who knows? Because who knows what Putin has in mind for this, and that's not to say that he's just trying to take the eye off what's going on over in the Eastern Front on Asia. So that's the other thing, too. So we got to see whether or not they have BRIC countries that are working with the Chinese that are also trying to do a sleight of hand, because there's been a lot of activity in Taiwan, and we cannot forget about what's going on in Africa, because
Phil,
there are a lot of African.
Thank you. We'll come back to that. Africa is a very interesting subject. Let's keep it European. Let me come over to Phil and ask you, Phil, how long is Mr. Putin going to stay put in?
I think it's just speculation at this point. We can all throw in the dead pool and.
You're not hearing anything?
I'll take a week or two. I mean, a month or two.
Your sources aren't telling you anything?
Nobody knows. Here's the thing. It's fair to assume that we have assets in place who are willing and ready to take over once he is deposed.
Right. You mean, so Russians who are ready to jump in there. No doubt there are plenty of people who are at their wits' end, and financially, too.
Yeah.
Yeah. Ivo, care to comment on that?
Well, just that at the very beginning of the whole thing, people were joking that once Putin has done what he had done, probably his minister Shoigu was going to the gulag in which Navalny is being kept, and saying, "Oh, Alexei, when they were poisoning you, I told them to." Tiny little bit of poison only to be administered.
Yes,
so
not too
because we
much.
like you, and
Not too much.
you will be president soon, and I like you much.
Of course. In the future. The future belongs to you. Yeah.
So who knows?
Yeah, who knows? Who knows?
I don't know whether Navalny would be actually better.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, Olgierd. Olgierd, go ahead.
I don't think he will be actually that much better. He is a well-educated, strong-headed Russian patriot, and he was in support of Crimea takeover as well.
Yep.
So I don't really think he will be that much better. It's like a difference between Trotsky and Stalin.
Gosh, the United States is all. That's fine. Well, there's a big difference between. This is a good. We need a program for that, but that's interesting talking point. The long, not a talking point, a long subject, but everybody's always saying the United States. They've Cuba. We didn't invade Cuba. It's right there.
We tried,
Yeah.
failed miserably.
Well, we didn't really try. I mean, you and I didn't.
Pretended to try.
You and I didn't try.
No.
It was a little before our time. Evo was there.
Oh, yeah.
Evo was there.
With my
Visiting Castro with his grandparents.
the old pals, we go
The old days
yeah.
when everybody was together
back
and happy.
back when Tobago was actually a fiefdom of Poland.
No,
So,
Tobago was. I thought you mean that's a sauce, isn't it? That you use
No, that's
Tobago
Tabasco.
sauce. Oh, Tabasco sauce. Oh,
Yes,
sorry.
Tobago. I was just in Trinidad Tobago. Yeah.
It's
I was
easy.
just referring to the 17th century when. Never mind.
I'm not too good at history or language, but everybody knows that already. As we come down, yes, as we're coming down at the end of this segment, Tony, what's your view on the longevity of Mr. Putin?
His time is limited, and he knows it. The oligarchs have already expressed distrust and disdain in him. So his time is limited, but it's a matter of how many people still trust him and how many people still want him to be in power is the question. Whether or not the axes of allies that he's trying to create around the world is going to determine whether or not how long he stays in power. That's why I mentioned Africa. That's why I didn't even get to mention South America, and let alone any of the other countries that are mainly supporting the long-supported allies for the Russian Empire, the Russian Federation. So that's one of the things that we have to take a look into, see how long he's going to be in there. And that's if he doesn't start already plans, which we know he probably has, to kill off a lot of the oligarchs that are standing against him.
Right. Very good. So thank you very much for watching. We now go to these exceptionally clever messages from our sponsors. See you after the break. The question of my toupee was addressed. Oh, welcome back. During the break, my lawyer has advised me against any disclosure. So, sorry about that. But you never know. Maybe next week. Could happen. Phil will be tap dancing at the end of this segment.
Remotely, as I will be from the remote office in Fort Wayne, Indiana.
Yeah, we'll get you. No, we're going to get you. You'll be doing from Indiana next week because you're going tomorrow. You'll be giving us square dance instructions.
Actually, I may come next week. I may be in Washington.
Really?
It's possible, yes.
Oh, very nice. Very nice. Very nice. And the on the horn, we still have our friends Olgierd and Ujembo, and I was just told, the producer tells me in my ear that was an excellent pronunciation. So I finally got it right. It's been how many times we've been on this program? And the illustrious, and not to be forgotten, Anthony McFarlane Gonzalez, former professional wrestler. And boy, you've really slimmed down since your wrestling days. You were, yeah? They called you the blind assassin. I remember. That was weird because you fought with your eyes closed. Weird. But it's a gimmick, and you got to have one, right? Who was the blind assassin? He's the guy who can't see, and he's really skinny. You used to get on your bike and ride it around in the, in the rain. They couldn't...
I was being led like a horse on a bike, just blindly walking around in circles on a lead.
Yeah, and they still couldn't get you. And people say that this is fixed, this sport. I don't believe it. Anyway, it's Ivo's favorite sport. That's why I brought it. Big fan of yours. And he would like you to autograph one of your pairs of shorts for him. One of your wrestling shorts. He collects
I'm sure
shorts.
we could organize that.
The gold
Or
lame,
cape.
the
Or
gold
the cape. The
lame
gold
shorts.
lame cape. That's right. He has some. You have Mike Tyson's shorts with the.
I think you're confusing me with yourself. I never met Mike Tyson in my life. Unlike you, actually.
I didn't meet Mike Tyson. In fact, I gave him my copies of God's Playground because he was asking me so many questions about Poland. He was fascinated. Yeah, he's a smart guy actually, but just not educated. Anyway, I collect and socks of famous people. I have a sock collection. Yeah, Woody Allen had string. I have socks, and I think that's fair enough, don't you?
Well, as long as you don't end up like Woody Allen. But
listen, you
There
don't want
are
to end up
worse
like Woody.
fates.
I know, you're like Harry Potter's Dobby.
What?
You're collecting socks to free yourself.
Yes, I've never even read a Harry Potter or seen a film. Is that good stuff?
overrated.
Right.
I hear it's more
You see,
popular
don't you
than
understand
Jesus.
Why are you like Putin? You'll see.
It's more popular than Jesus. That's what John Lennon said once and got in a lot of trouble. But he meant it in a bad way, that Jesus should be more popular than Beatles or Harry Potters, which is, of course, true. There's a subject that's come up recently. I was reading something about the reparations, Poland is asking officially for reparations from Germany. Now, this is going to be obviously a controversial issue. Some people will say that Poland's already had a lot of extra money from the EU, rebuilding the country, and so forth. But there is no doubt that Poland was reduced to ashes by the Germans and the Russians. That maybe the Russians should be in on this too, with free petroleum for a while and gas, because these two countries divided up Poland and then began to murder the populace individually, wholesale, any way you could do it, camps in the streets, summary executions, you name it, everything possible that could have been done to horrify and terrify populace was done in this country. Let that be the first thing that we talk about, be the first thing that we mention and are aware of when we talk about war guilt. Poland was in no way, as a nation, as a populace, as a supporter, in any large sense, in any except very fringe sense, which there's always fringes of the Nazis or even the Soviets at that point.
I don't know much about how much Poland has or has not received over the past 70 years insofar as German war reparations are concerned. I would, however, suggest this, that Poland has yet to come clean with its own reparations for land appropriated by the communist government, for land reforms. They owe a lot of people a lot of property in return, and it's a little disingenuous for the government to have its hand out over here, but to refuse to release what it's already taken over there.
Okay, point well taken. But a lot of stuff has been given back. But when records are destroyed and you decimate a population, again, you have to go to the source of the problem. The source of the problem was not ill will on Poland's part.
After the war, it was ill will on the part of the communist government.
Yeah, but that's run by the Russians, not by the Poles. The Poles didn't make independent decisions.
It's still a domestic government.
Under Stalin?
It's
Poles
still a domestic
they couldn't even
government,
choose
and
between
so
them.
lack of records is not appropriate.
Come on,
It's not
let's use common sense. The Poles were occupied in partitions. I mean, this is just a fact, okay? There were 20 years from the late 1700s in which Poland tried to hold on to its freedom. Very difficult time, interwar period. Then decimated again. This time they're really going to do the job right. They're going to level the country, like the Swedes tried to do in the deluge, right? Several hundred years before. I'm going to defer to my wise colleague here, my next one. Thank you, Phil, for your comment, which was well taken. And I'd like for you to expand on this. And then we'll go to Olgierd. Yes.
Actually, decimation means that every 10th person.
Every 10th person, yeah.
Well, in Poland it was actually almost twice as much,
Yeah.
or twice as many. Just to give you sort of a simple way to think of it, Poland regained its pre-war level of population in the year 1978. Okay, so and we're just talking about the population. Yeah, in terms of the devastation to the economy, in terms of unbelievable amounts of art that was looted by the Germans and taken back to Germany, ending up in the great, hoard of stolen art of Hermann Göring, among others. Almost none of it was returned. The entire factories were looted, first by Germans, then by the Soviets. Warsaw was leveled. Probably about 85% of all the buildings in Warsaw were actually leveled, right? After the uprising, not from, well, there was the destruction from combat, but then it was a systematic dynamiting of the city after the uprising fell, etc., etc. So every family lost their members in the war. And really, Poland is back to sort of normal in the past 10 years or so.
That seems to be true.
So this is
approaching normality.
This is something that you have to take into account. That and there were virtually no reparations from Germany whatsoever, because the Soviet Union, which was the great power controlling Poland at that time, said no. Why? Because they were afraid that East Germany would then have to fork over some dough to Poland, right? East Germany, which was also part of the Russian Soviet Empire at that time. So this is an issue that was remaining unaddressed, right, for a very long time. It took a long time, also several years, to actually compile some sort of an fairly exhaustive report and calculate those losses. And they're enormous, right? They are enormous.
I think you can't calculate them in terms of $1 trillion dollars or euros.
Well, I mean,
it's impossible to count all those lives.
But also, how can you calculate the fact that
the cultural damage
that my mother, as a young girl, witnessed an execution, street execution of 18 men, right across the street from her house? I mean, can you put a price on that? You cannot. So. So I think that something should happen with it. And as far as Phil's voice, well, unfortunately, in the early 90s, when Poland was regaining its independence, there was no wide reprivatization, right? So the property confiscated by the communist government, which was indeed fully controlled by Moscow, was never systematically returned to the owners. Instead, it was sort of an effort that is now still happening, and in order to get your property, if you had some or your family had something, before the war that was confiscated from 45 on by the communists, you can go through a court proceedings, and I know a lot of people have. So, of course, it is not ideal, but something is happening in this direction. I know of actually large, swathes of property. For instance, the a great area of southern Warsaw, where now we have the
Praca WZ.
or Wilanów city, so-called, was returned to the rightful owners, one of the Polish aristocratic families. But of course, yes, this is something that was not fully done, and it will, it will take probably a very long time, and a lot of people just gave up. And it also created opportunities for other people to, shall we say, do rather dishonorable things like buy people's claims for a very small price, and then use their way in the courts. That was especially to get that property in the name of that person, and make big fortunes out of it. That was a scandalous thing that was happening in Warsaw, especially in Krakow to some degree, especially in the first half of the 2000s. But again, this is something that there was a stop put to it. So it was not ideal, but there is now, I think, more of an effort to slowly compensate at least some, which is unfortunate. But that was the political climate of the 90s, and let's remember that the 90s were a time in which the post-communists returned to power, and they were extremely influential. And I think that was, in fact, it was the then President Kwaśniewski, the ex-communist, who refused to sign or vetoed the law that would actually create a full reprivatization. So,
yeah. Excellent comment, Ivo, because you have personal experience with this, and you're so much more knowledgeable on it than I would be. I'd like to ask Olgierd as well, whose family, long-term living in eastern Poland. You're actually there now in the ancestral plot. What do you have an opinion that you'd like to voice on this, Olgierd? You usually do.
Well, there is a lot of responsibilities lying here with our government, because it is legally inheriting the problems from former communist government, because it was never properly recognized that it was not really our own independent government, and it wasn't since 1948, at least, when Rokossowski and the other people came over and took over practically reins of Polish Republic. Well, there is a lot of things that, we were not paid by the Germans. My family, my grandfather died in the camp. The polygon built by Russians destroyed my old house, and I live in the house built in the 50s, not in the old house, and we never got paid for that either. And my father's family from Lvov. There is a problem. What are we going
from Lvov? You said, right? Yeah. Okay.
Lvov.
Yeah.
And what are we going to go to Ukrainian government, because now they are there?
Yeah.
Or to the Russians? But no, the Soviet Union was not really Russia. They are only Russians only when it's Soviet Union is Russia, or it's not Russia when it's not convenient for them. Actually, I do think that Russians are also owing us a lot of reparations.
Yeah, that's why I was saying lots of free energy and gas. I agree. But what about, how do you deal with the level? I mean, Ivo poses the question, and you follow it up by talking about personal experiences in your family. How do you replace that kind of destruction? I mean, this is a problem with any kind of reparation idea, whether it's in the United States, here, wherever it is. How do you replace the damage that is done, particularly if the people who are alive now are not the ones who did it? Although, in Poland's case, we can say that certainly there are plenty of communists alive in Russia and in Poland who sympathize, who had a lot to do with sowing this confusion, basically. Because if you don't know which property you own and and you don't have a connection to your hometown, then you really don't know who you are. That's this kind of confusion separates people and pits them against each other. And I think that's what's being done also to some extent.
That puts people against each other, because you've got a lot of people who, like in Warsaw, they lived in a government property or in a government-owned or city-owned property, and now suddenly they learn, now we are owned by somebody else, and for them it is a problem.
Yeah, there's a lot of problems like this, but I think it's important to go back, just as I mentioned at the beginning, if I may.
Basically, we can solve it, but we need funding, and without outside help from people who are really responsible, we're not going to have the proper funding, because it needs still a lot of rebuilding. Imagine what is going to happen with reparations for Ukraine. How are we going to get the money from Russia for what they did?
And to be fair, in Poland, returning property is oftentimes not an option for precisely the reason that it now belongs to many other people, and it's difficult to throw them out. So it has to be recompensation rather than return.
Yes.
Or, for example, the expressway along the southern side of Warsaw's central district, Trasa Wózet, that was an area with many villas in it. They were systematically destroyed under the social reforms of the 1960s and 70s. That's why they built that particular highway there, was so they could destroy bourgeois mansions.
Okay,
How can you give back something that's now a road?
Yeah, sure. I mean, we could go on and on with these different property cases. We all know something about that, particularly our two Polish members of the discussion. But I'm wondering, not just how you affix blame, but and what levels of reparations there are, is how do you say to people, when you look at World War II, it was Germany and Russia, that Poland was not complicit in any way in its own invasion? You know, the idea that Poles cooperated with their own invasion, especially after the 100 and whatever, how many years of partition?
123.
123. And Poland flourished so well during the interwar period, even though there were problems with the government. The first president was murdered, actually, by some insane person. But how do you combat the arguments that come up consistently, even in an article I read recently from Jerusalem Post, that Poland, insinuating that Poland is somehow complicit with the Germans and the Russians? I just don't understand it. And the only conclusion I can make is that they don't like the present government
Poland,
now.
remember, Poland, what Ukraine has done over the last 6 months, Poland did 102 years ago, fighting off the Soviet invasion, the miracle of the Vistula.
Well, that was 100 years ago. Yeah.
100, 102?
Yeah.
Yeah, 102 years ago. Yeah.
It was
1920.
August 1920.
Yeah, yeah. Ivo and I we've talked about, and Tannenberg is very relevant to now. But I just wanted to we're not going to finish this subject. Tony, do you have anything you'd like to say on this?
No, I don't have anything to say because I don't have personal experience, and I agree with Ivo and I agree with Olgerd that there are going to be extreme problems that we're going to face on both ends. Economically, to give that stuff back, land is going to be even harder to give back. And then that's where Phil's concept comes in, that it's going to have to be payment in return. But then again, that's going to be hard to prove without the records. And that also goes back to your point. A lot of those records were burnt. So, and then that also comes the problem with trying to suss out to see who's really the owners, and that's, yeah, it's a travesty. And the Germans still owe that to the Polish, and so do the Russians. But then again, as Olga said, how in the living name are we going to get those guys to actually give that stuff back?
Well, the Russians particularly, and we know how they pay back.
Yeah.
We've
been watching for 6 months, haven't we? Well, their turn is coming.
I think Ivo made an interesting point that there's how do we differentiate between Russian and Soviet spheres? And one of the things that we look at, if we look at the UN Security Council, the Soviet Union was a permanent member. Since the breakup of the Soviet Union, Russia has held that seat. But by what rights? Mm-hmm. Maybe it's time that Ukraine held that seat.
Well, possible. I mean,
that during UN times, Ukraine had a separate seat in the Congregation of Nations, and Belarus.
When was that?
During the Soviet time, they had
Soviet
three seats.
Yeah.
Yeah, not in the Security Council, but in the Congregation of Nations, there were 3 seats for Soviet Union.
And those seats were occupied.
Ukraine, Belarus, and Russian Federation.
And the Russian Federation. This is an extremely good point. That's why we have you on the show. So you can say things like that and elucidate for us, Professor. Thank you. I don't know how we will resolve this. This is going to be a continuing question, but I think we have at least shown some light on the problem and how complicated it is. But also, please, people need to stop blaming Poland for its own invasion. They can't, how woke can you be to come up with that one? How much virtue can you signal in the end? Shut up and read some history and stop Googling yourself.
Are you talking to Putin? Are you talking because he was blaming us for the invasion?
What, Poland?
That's true.
He's blaming Poland?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, last year, yeah.
Well, he was blaming Poland for the invasion of Ukraine, right?
No.
No, you mean the invasion in World War II in 1939.
Yes, basically, yeah.
Of course, everybody knows. I mean, I don't know what I've been saying. That's obviously he's right. I mean, there's some things, it's very worrying because there's some things that are on the face of it so absurd that you can't understand how people could possibly believe it,
Well, watch Russian TV.
Yeah, well, maybe in Russia, but not, we used to have plenty of free press, and it used to be common knowledge that Poland did not invade itself. And it is no longer common knowledge, apparently.
Well, come on, let's put it forward.
Yeah, and that Poles were running the concentration camps. I mean, come on.
I will always remind of Chechen. Let's remember that.
Yes, sir.
That was it. And we were not invading ourselves.
Well, right. Okay. So we got 5 minutes left. Let's go around and see what we think is going to happen between with the movements of the Ukrainians over the next week to 10 days. Who wants to go first?
I have a question.
Okay.
To our esteemed military friends and commentators. Do we know anything about the Ukrainian losses in the offensive? Because Russians are putting forward unbelievable numbers of tens of thousands dead Ukrainian soldiers.
We don't have any of the numbers out right now. They are keeping that very tight lip right now. I've been asking a lot of the Latvians and Estonians that do have operatives on the ground. Nothing. They don't have that, and I understand why they're doing that because they don't want to allow the Russian propaganda to take hold. Let them. Everyone knows that they're lying, but they want to keep that as also honorable for their families too, so that way they can contact the families before they put out the numbers. It's something typical that the U.S. does too.
Mm-hmm.
I did see that there were over 5,000 civilian deaths as a result, and over 10,000 injuries.
In this latest offensive?
No, in the total.
In total, we still don't. Okay, I thought we were talking about the offensive, but we don't know the numbers of Ukrainians that have died exactly. Do we, Ivo?
Well, no. But what we do know is that the resistance put up by the Russians was weak, and we know that a lot of the fighting was done, or the advancing was done by Ukrainian special forces, which would then mean that there was no potential for great losses in that particular push in the
Kharkiv, from Kharkiv
region. Yeah,
Kharkiv.
it's a different story in the south, right? Because there was frontal attacks there, so probably the losses were much higher.
Well, it's very interesting. This is a good point. You're all making very good points. But may I ask then, or frame this situation that we were talking about Kherson, and I think the Russians were worried about Kherson, or Kherson, or Kherson. Gosh, his pronunciation, I never know how. And then they forgot about Kharkiv to some extent, or they seem to have got weaker there, rushing people to the south. But they're still screwed in the south because Kherson's going to be cut off. They're the troops are trying to get out of there now, but that's in the regular press. This is now mainstream stuff, what's going on. And the accounts, what do you think about the accounts, Tony, of the soldiers, the Russian soldiers, about what they've been going through?
It's absolutely travesty, even for an enemy not to treat their soldiers like that, to just leave them behind and to their own fate, to their own will, and then let alone when they get back home, they're going to be considered traitors or some sort of nature of that nature. Or some might even be put in prison because they're considered what is it called?
Well,
Bill, help me out here with the calling
saboteur?
where somebody.
AWOL?
Yes, AWOL. Yeah, so something with AWOL where they
Absent
just
without
turn
leave.
tail in front.
Yeah.
No, it's
Deserters.
deserters. Thank you,
Deserters,
that's
yeah.
the word.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's what they're going to be considered because they turned tail and ran.
That
I mean,
they were
hell,
deserted
they-
themselves by their government is, of course,
Exactly.
bearing, yes.
But
Yeah,
you know,
but that's
the
not what they're
Russian
gonna do in
tradition.
Russia.
During Second
Exactly.
World War, POWs were actually directly put into the camps when they got back home.
Yeah, and also, this is a good point to end in the last minute or so with Tannenberg, the second Tannenberg, the first Grunwald, great Polish victory over the Teutonic Knights in 1410. But one of the biggest battles, and certainly the first big battle of World War I, was the Battle of Tannenberg in the same area.
Late August 1914. Yeah.
Yeah, and the Russians made they had 200,000 men, and they made an absolute disaster of it. It reminded me of the Kiev thing. And I only know about that because of you, Philip.
Thank you.
And we went there, and we toured the battlefields, and we actually did a series of programs about it for the travel show. And that was fascinating. So I became interested because of your interest in Tannenberg. So thanks for that. I suggest anyone who wants to see the history of, so many things. Communications went wrong. They couldn't move their troops. They couldn't keep them supplied with ammunition and food. Same story.
For anyone who's interested,
From 100
I
years
would
ago.
recommend first off starting with the Barbara Tuchman book, The Guns of August, and also looking at Solzhenitsyn's August 1914.
Yeah.
Those are the beginning points. There are a number of other historical accounts as well.
And they're good, and we have to finish, but they're well done, and they're good mirrors, distant mirrors. Another book by Barbara Tuchman about what's
The
been going on
parallels
today.
between 1914 Russian mistakes and 2022 Russian mistakes are uncanny.
Thank you for underlining that point. You said it better than I did. Thank you, Anthony, up there in Bydgoszcz, Anthony McFarland Gonzalez. Always a pleasure, sir.
Pleasure, guys.
Thank you, Olgjerd, and you helped us even with the English language, which is why you're here, to oversee the proceedings and keep us in line. And of course, the brilliant Ivo Binder and Philip Goss here in the studio, old friends and people who I always learn something from. And thank you for watching. May I say, you're looking well. Stay that way.